It was supposed to be a normal afternoon. A man stood on his own property. Land he paid for, lived on, and maintained. No crime. No disturbance. Just a quiet neighborhood under the sun. Then police cars pulled up. Lights flashing. Doors slamming. Voices shouting. Step away from the property. The man was confused. He calmly explained, "This is my home." But they didn't believe him. Why? Because to them, he didn't look like he belonged. Hands hovered near weapons. The word trespassing was repeated like a verdict already decided. Neighbors watched from a distance as a peaceful moment turned dangerous in seconds. One wrong move. One wrong assumption. One decision away from tragedy. Then the man said one sentence that changed everything. "I'm a federal agent. I work for the FBI." Suddenly, silence. The same officers who were shouting moments earlier froze. Radios crackled. Supervisors were called. The power shifted instantly. But here's the question that should haunt all of us. What if he wasn't FBI? It started like any ordinary afternoon. Quiet, calm, and completely unremarkable. The kind of day where nothing feels urgent, and the world seems to move a little slower. A black man stood on his own property, walking along the fence line near his home, checking for loose boards after a recent storm. It was routine. Something he'd done dozens of times before. The sun hung high in the sky. Birds chirped. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost still. Then everything changed. Out of nowhere, police cruisers pulled up fast. Red and blue lights exploded across the yard. Tires crunched against gravel. Car doors slammed open with sharp finality. The calm shattered in seconds. "Hey, step away from the fence," a voice shouted. The man froze, heart pounding. Officers rushed toward him, hands hovering near their weapons, eyes locked onto him like he was already guilty of something. They demanded to know what he was doing there, why he was on the property, who he was, and what he was planning. Confused but composed, he answered honestly. "This is my property," he said calmly. "I live here." But the officers didn't accept that. They questioned him again and again. Their tone hardened. Their skepticism grew. One officer accused him of trespassing, insisting a neighbor had reported a suspicious man on the land. Suspicious. On land he legally owned. He tried to explain, pointing to the house, the fence, the paperwork inside. But explanations didn't matter. To them, something didn't add up. He didn't look like the kind of person who belonged there. And in that moment, the situation shifted from confusing to dangerous. Hands were placed on weapons. Commands became louder, shorter, sharper. Every movement he made was watched, judged, and interpreted as a threat. He knew one wrong word, one wrong step, could change everything. This wasn't just about a property line anymore. It was about assumptions. It was about perception. It was about how quickly a normal day can turn into a life-altering encounter. Because when assumptions take control, facts stop mattering. And when facts don't matter, lives hang in the balance. Step away from the property. The command was sharp, final, and repeated as if there was no room for discussion. The officer stood in a loose semicircle, blocking his path, their posture tense and unyielding. This was land the man had paid for, worked on, and called home. But suddenly, none of that seemed to matter. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in an attempt to de-escalate. His voice remained steady, measured. "This is my home," he said again. "I can show you the documents. The deed is inside." Instead of listening, the officers moved closer. One of them placed a hand on his holster. Another barked orders faster than he could respond. The word trespassing was thrown at him again and again, each time heavier than the last, as if repetition alone could rewrite reality. "Sir, step back now. Do not argue. You're being detained." The air felt tighter, hotter. Every second stretched. He could feel eyes on him, curtains shifting, doors cracking open. Neighbors had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Some watched in silence. Others whispered. No one intervened. The man remained calm, but inside his chest, something twisted. He knew this wasn't about verifying ownership. It wasn't about safety or procedure. If it were, Someone would have listened by now. Someone would have checked records. Someone would have asked a different question. This was about how he looked standing on that land. This was about assumptions made in seconds, about who belonged and who didn't. He chose every movement carefully, aware that even a small gesture could be misinterpreted. He spoke slower now, respectful, deliberate, as if trying to prove not just his innocence, but his humanity. "I live here," he repeated quietly. But the officers had already decided their version of the story. What they didn't realize, what no one watching from across the street could see, was that they were making a massive mistake. Not just a misunderstanding, but a documented, undeniable error. Because this man didn't just claim the property. He could prove it. And when the truth finally surfaced, the balance of power would shift fast. What began as a command would soon become an apology. And the situation they tried to control was about to turn completely upside down. After several long, suffocating minutes, the man finally spoke again. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't challenge. It was calm, almost surgical. He looked directly at the officers and said, "I'm a federal agent. I work for the FBI." The words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. For a split second, nothing happened. Then one officer let out a short laugh, shaking his head like he'd just heard a bad excuse. Another scoffed, dismissing it outright. They'd heard claims like that before, or so they thought. "Yeah, okay," one of them muttered. But the man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He reached slowly, carefully, exactly as trained, and informed them where his identification was. Every movement was deliberate, every word precise. When he produced the credentials, the tone shifted. Not dramatically at first, just a crack in the confidence. An officer took the ID, looked at it longer than expected, then looked again. His jaw tightened. Another officer leaned in, suddenly interested. The radio crackled to life. Call signs, badge numbers, quiet questions spoken into microphones. What had been chaos moments earlier turned into controlled, nervous coordination. A supervisor was requested, then confirmed, then requested again. The officers straightened their posture. Voices dropped. Commands disappeared. The man stood in the same place he had been the entire time, calm, composed, unmoving. But everything around him had changed. The same people who had accused him of trespassing were now avoiding eye contact. One officer cleared his throat. Another shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of where to stand. The air wasn't tense anymore. It was awkward, uncomfortable, because the story they had confidently told themselves was falling apart in real time. This wasn't a suspicious stranger. This wasn't a trespasser. This wasn't someone who needed to explain why he belonged. The man they had challenged wasn't just a homeowner. He was federal law enforcement, trained, credentialed, and protected by the very system they believed they were enforcing. And in that moment, the power dynamic flipped completely. Not because he raised his voice, not because he resisted, but because the truth had finally forced its way into the conversation. And now, every assumption made before that sentence suddenly mattered. Once the truth could no longer be ignored, everything changed, fast. The sharp commands disappeared. Voices softened. Shoulders relaxed. One officer cleared his throat and mumbled an apology. Another tried to reframe the moment, saying they were just doing their job and wanted to clear things up before anyone got hurt. They spoke carefully now, politely. Suddenly, the same situation that had justified shouting, suspicion, and threats moments earlier was being treated like a simple misunderstanding. Paperwork could fix it. A quick explanation could smooth it over. No harm done. Except the harm had been done. Because fear doesn't disappear just because the danger passes. The man listened without interrupting, his expression controlled. But inside, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily. He knew how close things had come to going another way. He had lived through the tension. He had felt the calculation in every movement, every word chosen to avoid escalation. And then came the question that wouldn't go away. What if he wasn't FBI? What if he were just an average black homeowner? No badge, no credentials, no federal authority to force respect. What if he had nothing but his word and a deed inside the house? Would the officers have listened then? Or would the encounter have ended very differently? Later, The man would explain that even with years of training, experience in high-pressure situations, and a full understanding of police procedures, the encounter shook him deeply. He knew the statistics. He knew the outcomes. He knew how often moments like this turn tragic, not because of crime, but because of assumptions. This wasn't just about a single mistake or one bad call. It was about how quickly a peaceful situation can be redefined as a threat based solely on appearance. How easily authority can escalate without evidence. How fragile safety becomes when bias enters the equation. The officers eventually left. The lights shut off. The neighborhood returned to quiet. But the calm felt different now, because the man stood on his own property knowing one undeniable truth. His safety that day didn't come from innocence. It came from status. And that reality, more than anything else, was the most disturbing part. In the end, there were no charges, no arrests, no official wrongdoing recorded. The officers left quietly, their vehicles disappearing down the street, as if nothing unusual had happened. Gradually, the neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm. Doors closed, curtains fell back into place, and the flashing lights became a distant memory. But the message didn't leave with them. It lingered in the silence. This story isn't shocking because an FBI agent was mistaken for a trespasser. Mistakes happen. Misunderstandings occur. What makes this moment disturbing is how easily the situation escalated, and how different the outcome might have been without a badge, credentials, or institutional authority to command respect. Because this doesn't happen once. It happens every day. To people who don't have federal backing. To homeowners who only have their word. To individuals who are forced to explain their presence in spaces they rightfully belong. 5 minutes. 5 assumptions. 5 decisions made under pressure. Each one carried weight. Each one had the power to shift the outcome toward safety or tragedy. The number 5 becomes a reminder that moments matter, that snap judgments matter, that awareness matters more than most people realize. This incident forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How often is authority guided by bias rather than evidence? Why does respect sometimes come only after credentials are revealed? And why should anyone need to prove their worth, legitimacy, or right to exist in their own space? The man walked away physically unharmed, but not untouched. Encounters like this don't fade easily. They reshape how someone moves through the world, how cautious they are, how aware they become, how carefully they choose their words in moments that shouldn't require fear at all. This was never just about one man or one afternoon. It's about accountability. It's about empathy. It's about recognizing how quickly power can be misused when assumptions replace facts. Because no one should have to prove they belong on their own property. And no one should fear for their safety simply for existing. If this story made you uncomfortable, it should. Discomfort is often the first step toward change. And change begins when we decide to see people, not assumptions. No charges were filed. No arrests were made. The officers left, and life went on. But the truth stayed behind. This story isn't shocking because an FBI agent was mistaken for a trespasser. It's shocking because this happens every day to people who don't have a badge to protect them. 5 minutes. 5 assumptions. 5 choices that could have ended very differently. No one should have to prove they belong on their own property. And no one should fear for their life, just for existing. If this story made you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is where awareness begins. Backhand index pointing right, follow for more stories that matter. Share this, because silence helps no one.